Sometimes they stood atop a small footstand, visible over a crush of fascinated onlookers. As many as 100 slaves might occupy a single block, overseen by a few slave traders whose business was advertised by the painted signs hanging overhead. T. Hart, slaves. Charles Lamarck and Company, Negroes. Here the traveling observers and writers found what they were looking for, a part of slavery that could be used to understand the whole of the institution. Slavery reduced to the simplicity of a pure form, a person with a price. The walls surrounding the pens were so high, 15 or 20 feet, that one New Orleans slave dealer thought they could keep out the wind. Inside those walls the air must have been thick with overcrowding, smoke and shit and lie, the smells of 50 or 100 people forced to live in a space the size of a home lot. And the sounds that came over the walls from the street outside must have been muted and mixed. Horses' hooves striking the stone-paved street, cart wheels and street cars, fragments of conversation, laughter, shouting. Along the inside walls were privies, kitchens, dressing rooms, and jails. The jails were sometimes as many as 3 stories high and built of brick. They looked like the slave quarters that can be seen today in the yards of many New Orleans houses, steep-backed, 1 room deep, and fronted with railed galleries. In the 19th century slave pens, however, those galleries were lined with barred windows and doors that locked from the outside. Behind the doors were simple rooms with bare pine floors and plain plastered walls. Measuring 10 or 12 feet across, they were intended for multiple occupancy. On the ground floor of one of the jails or across the yard were offices and a showroom. The traders' offices were probably the type of spaces where nobody sat down, places for drinking, pacing, signing, and counting. The real business took place in the showrooms, which were large enough for 100 slaves to be arrayed around their walls, questioned and examined. These rooms had finished floors and painted walls, a fireplace, a few chairs, and doors all around. A door from the offices where the traders did their counting and signing, a door from the street where the buyers gathered before the pens opened, and a door from the yard where the slaves waited to be sold. What follows is the story of these showrooms. It is a story of back-and-forth glances and estimations, of hushed conspiracies and loud boasts, of power, fear, and desire, of mistrust and dissimulation, of human beings broken down into parts and recomposed as commodities, of futures promised, purchased, and resisted. It is in no small measure the story of antebellum slavery. The bargains, sealed in the New Orleans slave pens, were centuries in the making, late additions to a 400-year history by which the trade in African and African-descended people transformed the New World. By the end of the 15th century, Portuguese merchants and soldiers had dotted 4,000 miles of the west coast of Africa with outposts, where they traded for slaves to export to sugar and wine-producing islands off the coast. The Portuguese were shortly followed to Africa by the other imperial powers of Europe, the Spanish in the 16th century, the Dutch, Danes, French, and English in the 17th. Beginning in the 1650s, when sugar planted on Barbados and in Brazil began to grow into huge profits for colonial planters and metropolitan shippers, the African trade was a central concern of Europe's colonial powers, each of which attempted to control it through exclusive licensing and colonial customs. The word for the economic theory behind the trade has come down to us scrubbed clean by usage: mercantilism. Colonial staples, shipped from abroad and finished at home, would yield metropolitan profits, which would be shared with the monopoly-granting state. And colonial markets would consume domestic manufactures, profits again dutied and taxed into state revenue. In practice, this meant that well-connected investors could form themselves into syndicates like the Royal African Company and the Dutch West India Company, and receive monopoly license from their governments to pursue trade in other parts of the world, license to make war on